Now, the Beatles were four lads from Liverpool, as everybody knows, and they have really kind of helped put Liverpool on the map. They got together in the early 60s. They actually started in the late 50s. It was John Lennon who first put a band together. Paul McCartney joined his band, the Quarrymen. The band grew from there with George Harrison joining them because he was at school with Paul McCartney. And then it was actually just before the Beatles released their first single in 1962, Love Me Do, that Ringo joined the band as their drummer. So that was when the four Beatles as we know them were all in place. Now, they went on to get their first record contract 1 year later in 1963, and from there really that was the beginning of their fame and success. Now, they disbanded in 1970, so over that period they were amazingly successful and took the world by storm, and that's something that Liverpool kind of really reaps the benefits of these days, because it's amazing how Liverpool welcomes visitors from all over the world who come here because of the Beatles, and it's amazing to see how far their kind of reach spread. Every year in Liverpool we have an annual Beatles festival, and we call it the International Beatles Festival. There are bands, tribute acts from all over the world, about 20 different countries that come here and perform for a week of Beatles music all around the Cavern and the city centre. But there are fans from about 40 different countries around the world who come here to enjoy it, so it really shows how far the Beatles and their music managed to spread around the world.
You can't estimate the influence of the Beatles on music everywhere. And when we have our Beatles Festival in August, you realise that because, as you say, there are people from all around the world coming and singing Beatles music, and they just want to come to Liverpool to do it.
From all the people I've met in Liverpool, the sadness is that they were never captured live in Liverpool. And John Lennon always said, if you didn't see the Beatles in Liverpool or Hamburg, you never saw the real Beatles. They had become just the greatest rock and roll band. And only if you lived in those two places and saw them did you ever see the real Beatles. I'd love to have seen that. Most people know about the Cavern Club. You know, they refer to the Cavern Club as the birthplace of the Beatles. It wasn't. There was a club called the Casbah Coffee Club in West Derby, a little suburb of Liverpool, and it was a club that was formed in the basement of Pete Best's house. Pete Best's mother, Mona, decided to open a rock and roll club in the basement of their house. That opened in August '59. All the main Merseybeat groups became famous or didn't become famous, all played there before the Cavern became a rock and roll place. The Cavern was still playing jazz, whereas the Casbah was playing rock and roll. The Quarrymen, John Paul George, plus a guy called Ken Brown, opened the Casbah Club. They even decorated it. You can still see it now. You've got a whole ceiling which is hand painted by John Lennon, another one hand painted by Paul.
They take you back to your childhood as well as John and Paul's childhood. And when you think of the songs that were written in the houses, and it's just wonderful.
Now, when I grew up, my parents were into the Rolling Stones. They weren't really into the Beatles, but my kind of lasting impression about the Beatles and how I kind of first started to notice them, I was about 10 years old and I went on a school trip, and everybody on the coach when we were kind of traveling on this trip was singing Beatles songs, and I was kind of aware of them but I didn't know them, but I started to realise then it was like this music that everybody kind of knew and that really kind of brought people together. It was very, very popular, and I started to kind of get into their music probably because kids at school were at that stage, and it's really been kind of growing up in Liverpool, you get more aware of them, but then kind of getting a tourist guide, you really kind of get then the ability to get into them in a level that you've maybe never considered before. So I've been kind of a fan, but in a kind of just a music enjoyment way. And it's really been since kind of, you know, welcoming more people that I'm just amazed at kind of the influence that they've had on kind of a different level these days.
I sort of got into it when I was about 10 and I started playing guitar. And then I started wanting to know more. So I started buying Beatles books. And I wanted a Beatles book about the Beatles and Liverpool, and I couldn't find one. And so I wrote one. It took me 9 years to do. Because I'm too young to have seen them first time. I then went out to try and find the people who were there at the time and get their stories. And from a little project, it just grew and grew and grew. Over the years, I spoke to like members of the Quarrymen, which was John Lennon's first group, and they'd become friends. I've spoke to Pete Best, who was the drummer before Ringo Starr, and he wrote the foreword to my first book. I've spoken to their first managers, promoters, school friends, so I get a real good picture of what they were like when they were growing up in Liverpool, because nobody had done a book which just focused on the Liverpool part of it. Even though that's where they're from, the city that shaped them, nobody had done a book just on Liverpool. And so I could put so much more detail because I knew the areas they grew up in, I knew the schools they went to, and could explain the geography of how they met. So from being a bit of a fan, I've become a Beatle nut.
They did an amazing wealth of music, and there's a huge diversity there that manages to touch, you know, and interest lots of different people. What I love is taking tours out and seeing that, you know, there are young children who are bringing their parents here, or, you know, their parents are bringing the kid along because they're really into the Beatles. So there's something really kind of appealing about their music, and there's lots of different levels for people to get into.
I think when it comes down to the basic bits, it's the reason we're still talking about Mozart and Tchaikovsky is because their music was brilliant. When it comes down to it, in a couple of hundred years, they'll still be talking about the Beatles because their music was brilliant. And then I think the world was ready for something new. And I think it was the timing of coming to America in February 1964. JFK had just been assassinated in the November of '63. The US rock and roll music scene was going nowhere. The country was on a downer, it needed something new.
There was a lot of influence from America and American artists, and rock and roll, of course, was very strong. But then in the UK, there were a lot of performers who were quite clean cut, had very kind of wholesome images as well, maybe from the south of England. And what the Beatles really did was kind of cut a path for bands that were a little bit more rough around the edges, a bit more working class. They didn't come from London or the southeast, they were from the north, and they had different accents. And that was really at a time when a lot of things that people saw in the media or on television had a certain type of pronunciation, a certain, you know, suits and ways of behaving. And it's amazing really the influence that the Beatles had beyond their kind of music, just into the kind of culture of Britain at that time, just because they were kind of different from what people normally saw.
What the Beatles took was, they packaged everything good about Liverpool, which is a cosmopolitan city with a long, long history. They took American music, reinvented it, took it back to America and sold it to the Americans, and I think it was just a perfect moment in time that I don't think will be repeated, culturally, socially and musically. This was a group where there wasn't one lead singer. It wasn't somebody and a backing band. You ended up, by the time you get into the mid-60s, John, Paul and George all being equally good songwriters. So you had, instead of like Cliff Richard in the Shadows, who was a singer plucked out of a little club, given a backing band, and then said, somebody down here has written a song, you're going to sing it. The Beatles said, we're going to write our own songs. What they suddenly did was they gave permission to musicians to write and perform their own songs. Every single album they did was different. They tried things, they pushed the boundaries. It didn't always work, but they always did something new. They wanted to give something more to the fans. So the whole idea of the pop video, really that's what the Beatles used first. Making the album cover a work of art. A bit of a concept album with Sgt. Pepper. And always pushing the boundaries and saying, look, if you feel that's what you want to do, just do it. You've now got the opportunity. And they sort of opened the floodgates for groups everywhere, whichever country they came from, to do their own thing. Because Jimmy Page, during the 60s, was probably one of the hardest working session musicians. So before Led Zeppelin got together, he was just playing on so many other people's records that he was popular, and he would just work hard all the time. But they could do that because the Beatles had opened the floodgates, and now the record companies were all saying, we want groups with original material. It was only from somewhere around the springtime in 1962 that they started wearing suits and got tidied up, because they got their new manager, Brian Epstein, and he said to them, because before then they were in black leathers, they would eat, drink, smoke, swear, whatever on stage while performing. And he said, no, you've got to be professional. So he cleaned them up, smartened them up, taught them how to be presentable on stage to more than just a local Liverpool audience.
There are some people that would say he didn't make the greatest financial decisions for the Beatles in the early days, but there was not really anything that had come before him.
The rock and roll stuff, particularly in Hamburg, which really was the place that made the Beatles, was they took a bit of what they learnt in Liverpool, went to the clubs in Hamburg, and they were playing like 7 or 8 hours a night. And you either become successful or you collapse. And they became successful. But that was where they really were on the drink and the drugs, the women and the rock and roll. It all happened there. They were scruffy back then. But Brian said, if you're going to get out of Hamburg and Liverpool, you've got to be smart. And obviously, as soon as they could ditch that and be themselves, they did.
You know, in a way, they were a great outlet for him, because Brian had a very artistic side and he absolutely loved being involved with the group.
Brian Epstein, as the manager, had tried all the record companies. One by one, they all turned them down, until Parlophone, a little bit of EMI, decided to take a gamble. They were the last chance. They took the chance, they recorded them, and obviously they became very successful.
It was a match made in heaven, you know, for them to work together. And I'm inclined to agree that if he'd stayed alive, they would have stayed together longer. That's what I think anyway.
They started to break up when Brian Epstein died. He was their manager. He got them the record deals, he'd shaped them, he got everything done for them, and they worshipped the ground he walked on. And he died quite suddenly in the summer of '67. It was an accidental overdose of pills. And they were just lost. And they said, you know, nobody else would be their manager. And suddenly they didn't know which way to go. So Paul tried to take the lead and to drag the Beatles into other projects to keep it going. But it couldn't quite work, so there's tensions there. You know, they'd grown up, they'd had success, they'd married, and there were relationships changing. John then met Yoko, who took him in a different direction. Particularly John, Paul and George were now writing so many songs, you couldn't then fit them all onto one Beatles album. So they could put a Beatles album out and each do a solo album as well at the same time if they wanted. And they had so much that really they got to the stage where they couldn't work together. As most bands reach that stage and say, that's it, we can't do it. And so they called it quits in 1970. So they were the first of the groups, really, to make it big. The difference was, before then, most of the individuals were plucked out of the London music scene, which wasn't particularly big. What they didn't realise was, only 200 miles away in Liverpool, there was hundreds of clubs and hundreds of bands. For the Rolling Stones, it was very direct, because Dick Rowe, who was the managing director of Decca Records, who had turned the Beatles down in 1962, was judging a contest up in Liverpool with George Harrison. And George Harrison said, if you don't want to make the same mistake twice, go to this club in London, there's a group called the Rolling Stones, go and sign them. And he did. So actually the Beatles got the Rolling Stones their first contract, and their first hit was I Want to Be Your Man, which was written by Lennon and McCartney for Ringo. So that was also a Beatles song.
I've done Beatles tours for the Cavern, and that really kind of attracts some kind of die-hard fans of the Beatles, and there's been people, you know, that for coming to Liverpool has been a real pilgrimage.
I know that's a religious idea, but it is like a pilgrimage for some people. And of course, some of them keep coming back again, which is what we want.
And they've been very emotional to stand in front of Paul McCartney's house or to see Strawberry Fields, and that's an incredible feeling. But also to have a city like Liverpool, which was an incredibly kind of wealthy and important city at one time, and then it went through its period of decline in the 20th century. The Beatles really kind of helped reverse that situation, but also to see how Liverpool has been regenerating itself over recent years. But it's brilliant to see all the different visitors who come, a lot of them to see the Beatles, you know, from all over the world. And I used to live in Brazil, so I can speak Portuguese. And even the influence that the Beatles had over there was really important. When they had a dictatorship, the Beatles were very influential. And these days you can welcome lots of Brazilian guests here. So it's just an incredibly kind of fortunate thing to be able to do through kind of music and culture. It's great fun.
The time I remember for music when I was growing up was like through the 70s, so I've watched glam rock, punk, 80s electro, hip hop, you name it, all coming through. They're fads that come and go. What has been constant all the way through are guitar-based bands. Now they may be writing slightly different styles of music, but you look at the biggest artists over the last 20, 30 years still, you're looking at the big groups. I mean, look at U2, look at Coldplay, look at Bruce Springsteen. You know, again, Springsteen's one of those who will give full credit to the Beatles. So the most successful artists now are the guitar-based musicians and the guitar-based bands. So I think that's the legacy is still going on.
To think that it's carrying on all these years later, and there are young Beatles fans that you quite often meet on a tour, it's just amazing.
Just that the music is still so good, it's timeless. You can still listen to it and think, oh, I hadn't heard that bit before. The music will always be timeless.